After waking up, Juan Lopez goes out to do half an hour of exercise on his bicycle that was made by B-Mix. Inside the house, the electric conductors that give power to the house are from Nacobre, and the water from the shower runs through copper pipes made by Minera Frisco. And the same water was purified with treatment plants Ideal. While our character is dressing, he listens to music from a stereo purchased at Mix Up. The first phone call of the day is through the Telmex fixed line. The vehicle carries new tires of the Euskadi brand, purchased at the Sears stores. On the way to the office, the cell phone with a Telcel contract rings. Before he gets to work, he makes a stop at the Sambers cafeteria. After the first coffee, he wants a cigar, product of Cigatam. Arriving at work, the first thing it does is to connect the computer to check emails. The server used is Prodigy Infinitum Telmex. He also needs to be protected, so he turns to buy insurance for his car in Bursa. The day is coming to an end, and before he gets home, he makes a stop in Nacional de Dulces to buy a cake, accompanying a client to a hotel called Calinda, belonging to Real de Turismo. Finally, for a budget holiday, Volaris airline offers excellent routes at a low cost. These are or have been companies under his domain for more than 15 years. El Ingeniero, or the engineer in Spanish, as called by those closest to Carlos Slim, keep his place as the #1 entrepreneur among Mexico's major companies, thanks to the combination of higher sales level, market share, and stock funding. His companies currently account for 7.3% of Mexico's GDP. But before we go deeper into how he became the richest man in Mexico, and who has been the world's richest too, let's take a look at his origins and his family. From Lebanon, focus mainly on his father. In 1902, Julian Slim Haddad, father of Carlos Slim, arrived in Mexico fleeing the yoke of the Ottoman Empire, which forced young people at that time to join its army. He was 14 years old, and his brothers were based in Tampico, arriving 9 years after Jose, older brother. 5 years later, Jose opened a shop in the harbor, where he received his other brothers, before Julian. However, after various disputes between them, Jose left Tampico and moved to Mexico City in 1904 in search of new businesses. The newly arrived Julian joined him. Shortly thereafter, the other brothers reached them in the capital of the country and reassociated to open a haberdashery and silk shop, although they also began to seek and buy properties for rent and resale. Once within the capital of the country, the Slim brothers took advantage of the good contacts with the government of Porfirio Diaz, to the extent that they were very close in taking charge of the collection of taxes from the street vendors of the capital city. Eventually, they founded La Estrella de Oriente, the largest haberdashery store in the capital. While Jose was in charge of planning new businesses and pursuing his debtors, Pedro had the reputation of being the day-to-day manager of the haberdashery. In fact, in a document written by Slim himself, he reports that in 1911 his father, Julian Slim Haddad, had started the business with his brother, Jose, despite Jose being 13 years older than him. At first, each owned half of the shares, but in May 1914, Julian Slim decided to buy his brother's Jose's respective share. According to the magnate's document, by 21st January 1921, just 10 years after its founding, this company had merchandise worth more than $100,000 and had acquired dozen properties in the downtown of Mexico City, just in front of Palacio Nacional. Based on Slim, His father anticipated the entrepreneurial thinking of his time, as he had a profound mastery of commercial activity. Already in the 20s, it was said that the efficient trade was the one that sold large volumes with reduced margins and with facilities. This last factor is still not incorporated in large warehouses today. In February 1920, Pedro Slim died of the Spanish flu at the age of 33. His widow, Maria Mar, died days later, immediately before the death of both his brother and his sister-in-law. José Slim became the owner of his brother's property and took care of La Estrella de Oriente, as well of his children, through a legal process of adoption of minors. By then, José Slim was already one of the most prosperous entrepreneurs in the Lebanese community in Mexico. In 1923, he founded the first Lebanese Commerce Chamber, although close friends from El Ingeniero, or Carlos Slim, assure that it was his father who did that. In the mid-1930s, José fell ill with diabetes, and in 1939, he decided to return to Lebanon with his wife. His nephew accompanied him in convalescence. When he died, part of his fortune was used to build a Mexican house in Lebanon during the reign of Lázaro Cárdenas. José Slim was appointed as Mexican consul in Lebanon, but never took office due to his illness, which eventually killed him. By the 1940s, Julián Slim Haddad had already acquired his own reputation as an entrepreneur and also an impressive capital, like the rest of his brothers in fact. What distinguished him from them was that Julián had married the daughter of one of the most prestigious Lebanese of the time, Linda Elou. Linda's father was José Elou, director of the community's most influential newspaper and president of the Lebanese Circle in Mexico, married in August 1926. The first daughter of the marriage was Nour, born in 1930. Then came Alma, Julián, José, Linda, and Carlos, who was born on January 28, 1940. Julián Slim Haddad, influenced by his father-in-law, José Elou, became involved in politics. One of the things he did was advocate Lebanese immigration to Mexico. In the archives of the Department of Migration, it is observed that a large proportion of Lebanese arriving in Mexico gave Julián Slim as their reference inside the country. However, in June 1953, Julián Slim Haddad died of a heart attack, and he was farewelled at Palacio de Bellas Artes. Carlos Slim lost his father when he was only 13 years old, but no one believed that his father's teachings, such as good administration, accounting, and learning about businesses, will take him so far in life. Obtaining an engineering degree from UNAM, and hence the nickname, and giving algebra classes while studying, mainly for his fascination with mathematics. But quickly changing the subject, now let's find out whom he married. Slim married Sumaya Domit Gemayel, the nephew of the Lebanese president who ordered the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, in which phalangists killed more than 2,000 people, mostly Palestinian refugees, in Lebanon because of the war with Israel. The priest that officiated the wedding was Marcial Maciel, founder of Los Legionarios de Cristo, religious congregation that has suffered scandals of pedophilia and corruption until it was intervened by the Vatican. The couple gave birth to 6 children, 3 males, 3 females. Carlos, Marco Antonio, and Patrick Slim are directors of their core companies. Sumaya, Vanessa, and Joanna are involved in cultural activities, while their husbands occupy managerial positions in their father-in-law's companies. His numerous family in key positions is an elemental part of his conglomerate. But before going into depth, it is necessary to understand how did he become so rich. People have the idea that Slim became millionaire thanks to Telmex, when in reality his real fortune was made when he operated on the stock exchange in 1982 during the Mexican economic crisis. Since in 1980, Grupo Carso was formally born, and between 1981 and 1984, period of economic crisis in Mexico, his collective enterprise carried out a significant number of transactions, which Slim defines as Mexicanization of companies, a term that reflects the nationalism that usually appears in his language. The magnate writes, "In those years, and because many large domestic and foreign investors did not want to keep their investments, it was feasible to acquire, at prices well below their real value, most of several companies and even to Mexicanize several of them, among which are Reynolds Aluminum, Sanborns, Nacobre and their subsidiaries. Subsequently, we Mexicanized patrimonially and operatively Luxus, Euskadi, General Tire, Aluminum, and 30% of Condomex." It should be noted that he also had inside information and millions of dollars at his disposal at that time. He devoted himself in buying low-priced, bankrupt, or nearly bankrupt companies to eventually turn them around and sell them for a profit. He began to become famous for buying failed businesses that later became prosperous, such as the printing company Galas, Sanborns, which, before it was acquired, the company dragged a reputation of being a dirty and declining site. When Slim acquired it in 1985, the chain had 35 establishments and 6,500 employees. 30 years later, Slim managed to increase its size and value by 5, as well as its subsidiary, Dennis Sigatam, with which the surname of Slim began to become known among the national businessmen by acquiring a 10% of the same. Bimex, Hoteles Calinda, Reynolds Aluminum, Seguros de Mexico, Frisco. Carlitos himself admits that he bought at 1.5% of the book value, but he likes to emphasize that he was the only one taking the risk. And with all this, there's something important that you must know about him when it comes to business. One of the things that Slim highlights is the hardness with which he takes his business. A close collaborator of the late northern Mexican businessman Lorenzo Zambrano say that Cemex president and Slim were really good friends until the cemetery magnate decided to participate with a small percentage in Axtel, a telecom competitor to Telmex. This fact, in addition to cooling his personal relationship, caused the world's richest Mexican to decide to invest in the Moctezuma cemetery just to compete with his former friend. There are also fantastic stories of how a member of a Peruvian squad with whom Slim visited Machu Picchu reports that after arriving in the sacred city for the Incas, the magnate departed for a moment from the group to start making numbers. According to his testimony, after an hour, he reincorporated and said that he already had a new model for implementing a cell phone system in South America. According to Jacques Rogosinski, a key character in privatization within the period of Salinismo, one of the few factors analyzed by which Carlos Slim went from being a multimillionaire to an ultra-rich has to do with an American trial. In 2003, 2 U.S. bankruptcy judges assigned Slim all the assets of 2 American companies that had failed in Latin America. One was AT&T and the other was called MCI. Then Slim retains all assets. The great Mexican monopolist keeps all the assets because they say they can't compete. Well, I still have the great question of how this is possible. AT&T went bankrupt in Mexico for the first time, but then I don't think it was Slim, the monopoly, that didn't allow it to grow. Because if that was true, how did AT&T went bankrupt in the rest of Latin America? Why did they go bankrupt elsewhere where there's competition? Well, because they didn't know how to manage their investments in Latin America. These 2 gringos companies that came to Mexico could not either in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, and Slims enters an auction and gets all the assets of these two companies. And this is how América Móvil evolved into a wealthy enterprise in Latin America, and Slim's fortune grows so much. This explains why Telmex wasn't the true catalyst for Slim's fortune. So why do people believe so, and what controversies surround it? At a parade of workers on the 1st of May 1989, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who witnessed the event from the balcony of the National Palace, or Palacio Nacional, asked the leader of the workers of the state-owned company, Teléfonos de México, Telmex, to stop his march and go up with him to accompany him to watch the passage of the other workers' contingents. The government was preparing to privatize the state telephone company. A little over a year later, on December 11, 1990, Slim was presented as the winner. The first comprehensive journalistic report of the irregularities was Operación Telmex by Rafael Rodríguez Castañeda. In his book, the journalist anticipates the creation of a telephone monopoly with unlimited profits. He also quotes an article from the American magazine Business Week, published in July 1991, in which he assures rumors and allegations of friendship circled throughout the privatization process. In response, the government is doing the impossible to create an image of impartiality. For example, in the cabinet board that decided who will be the new owners of Telmex, the three candidates were named A, B, and C, but everybody knew who was who. We're not selling oranges, said the Secretary of State. The conditions of advantageous monopoly also had a political reason. The government had to prove that selling government companies was profitable, so it sought to consolidate and maximize Telmex to convert it in a case of success, rather than generating a competitive market. Slim's success as an entrepreneur meant the success of the pre-regime privatization policy. According to independent telecom specialists, much of the privatization in Latin America and the former republics of the USSR happened in a very similar way in the 90s, when they ceased to be a state monopoly. Two, or at most three, new dominant business players entered, in which one experienced operator and a huge backing capital were merged to manage the existing telephone networks, as creating a new was economically impossible. The transformation of Mexico's nationalist economy into a free market economy is similar to what Russia experienced during the Perestroika. Amidst these changes, almost simultaneously in both countries, billionaires appear for the first time at the center of political and social life. Several of these wealthy men starred in a capitalism in which influence trafficking filled the vacuum left by the lack of strong institutions and government. That is why the Mexican billionaires of the 21st century, in the face of some international scrutiny, are closer to the Russian oligarchs than to Gates, Buffett, or Soros. During the presidency of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, 1,000 public companies were privatized, and from all of them, the most profitable sale for the business world and controversial for the political sphere was that of Telmex, the only telephone company on the market. Until then, Slim had only appeared as one more of the entrepreneurs who had paired with Salinas de Gortari since the election campaign. He was less than 50 years old, and of what was little known about him was that he first worked as a stock exchange agent, like we mentioned before, and then became rich by buying companies in crisis, which he almost miraculously made profitable. The businessman ascended by a private elevator to the Forbes Club. During the years he opened his wallet to the PRI. According to the journalistic records of the time, the magnate donated at least $25 million to the official political party for the election campaign of who would be the next president of Mexico, in this case, Ernesto Zedillo, after the assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio, first official candidate designated. Within the negotiations that took place with Carlos Slim, one of the little known things about Slim's formal proposal to acquire Telmex is the special involvement of a group of Mexican businessmen. In this, it is specified that also participated through Grupo Carso on behalf of third parties, businessmen such as Agustín Franco and family, Miguel Alemán, Rómulo Farril, Bernardo Quintana, Antonio and Moisés Cosío, Ángel Lozada Moreno, Manuel Espinosa Iglesias, Antonio del Valle, the Mary Street Jenkins Foundation, José Miguel Nader, Claudio X González, Antonio Chedraui, Ángel de Merutis Elizarrarás. It is necessary to understand that there is a misconception about Carlos Slim being the absolute owner of Telmex, when in fact the friend of Salinas de Gortari, although no longer, is the owner of a part only since Southwestern Bell decided to contribute $72 million more to the group's offer. In other words, privatization did not only favor a friend of the president, but it was won by an American businessman. The irony. Love it. Ed Whitaker III, I believe that's how it's pronounced. I don't know, English is not my native language, was the one who gave more money than the rest. Easy as that. The media never mentioned that US shareholders earned $2 for one Slim received, nor paid too much attention to Telmex share capital composition at the end of the privatization process. So it ended up like this: 10% Southwestern Bell, 5.23% 32 Mexican investors, 5.17% Carlos Slim, 5% France Telecom, 4% reserved for workers, and the rest 70% were in New York and in Mexico's stock exchange. After taking control of the former Mexican state-owned company, one tactic Slim used was to use the capital generated by the growth of the mobile phone market in Mexico, which in 2 years went from 8.3 million to 96.2 million users, to economically strengthen his company América Móvil. And with a huge flow of money he owned, he started acquiring new companies in Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Colombia. Analyst Gerardo Esquivel produced a study for an organization named Iguales and Oxfam titled Extreme Inequality in Mexico: Concentration of Economic and Political Power, which was released in 2015, quoting also a study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, concludes that between 2005 and 2009, the monopoly of Slim's telecom companies meant a loss of well-being of more than $129 billion for us, the Mexicans. Approximately 1.8% of Mexico's GDP, owing to a lack of competition and high market concentration within an openly dysfunctional legal system. Former President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, at the request of the newspaper El Financiero, answered some common questions about this sale with an article published in 2 parts under the title Telmex, a successful privatization that ended in question. Argues that it was not carried out in a hurry or seeking to benefit hidden partners, and that the resources obtained never disappear from the treasury. This is a position that Salinas has voiced in other texts and public interventions. However, the last 3 points in the former president text are direct points against Slim, claiming that it is true that today Telmex is a private monopoly. Citing the OECD, Telmex controls in Mexico 80% of the fixed telephone market and 70% of mobile telephone. It is a company with dominant power in all segments of the market, and that as a dominant operator, it enjoys a lasting market power that competition is not undermining and that is not restricted by regulation in any effective way. The former president also states that Telmex is today an inefficient and abusive company. Finally, Salinas assures that it was not the privatization of Telmex made during his government that made Slim as the world's richest man. Slim did not inherit his fortune from Telmex, but instead took advantage of the lack of neoliberal regulation to consolidate in the emergence of a new sector, mobile telephony, and entered as a dominant in that sector also in Latin America. The fortune is in América Móvil, which was never a public enterprise. In 2012, That company was worth more than 100 billion. Telmex, for its part, 15 years after its sale, had the same value in real terms, including the amount of investment made during its expansion. Since this is a fragment of an interview made by Diego Enrique Osorno found on his book, Slim, the journalist asked Carlos Slim about this, and the magnate answered, "It is a lie, he only covers his part and everyone else did things wrong. He says Telmex is inefficient. What is inefficient? If it has come to compete with Telefonica, it has come to compete with AT&T, it has come to compete with Verizon and Vodafone as well. Do you think it's very inefficient if all those companies have not been able to?" So then again, the journalist asked Slim, "So what motivation will former President Salinas de Gortari have to pull this article out?" And Carlos Slim answers with elegance and eloquence to say that he is badass, that he made everything correctly, and the others were idiots and crooked, and Telmex is a shit. Accustomed to the criticism that accused him of monopoly, El Ingeniero's son-in-law, Arturo Elias Ayub, has a well-constructed paraphrase that we're going to paraphrase. Competition is open for local telephony since privatization. No one entered local telephony because the technological conditions did not allow it. No one dared to build a new telecommunications network. No one wants to invest a penny in these markets. There are no competitors willing to go to Sierra de Guerrero, Chiapas, or Oaxaca to put a cable. When Carlos Slim took control over Telmex, he obtained a monopoly because, legally speaking, it was the only company with the right to provide local and long-distance telephone services for 6 years. One of the few legal obligations that he had to accept was that he could not participate in the television sector dominated by Televisa. So these were some of the comments and results of such controversial privatization. But shortly after the acquisition of Telmex, the jewel of the crown, Slim had a good alliance with the Titanic company television in Latin America, and I'm talking about Televisa, the #1 generator of content in the Hispanic world. Slim maintained a strong alliance with Televisa before competing against it. In the last years of the life of Azcárraga Milmo, Slim bought up to 49% of shares in Cablevisión, owned by Televisa, with the purpose of helping the company's finance, despite the fact that such act violated the concession granted to Telmex. During the so-called tequila effect crisis, which occurred in late 1994 after Salinas de Gortari handed the presidency to Zedillo, both Televisa and Grupo Carso were accused from the anonymity by other businessmen of having received confidential information to change their debts in dollars to pesos before a drastic devaluation of the Mexican currency was announced. When Azcárraga Milmo died, Slim, in agreement with then-President Ernesto Zedillo, helped his son, Azcárraga Jean, retain control of the television company by buying the shares of the families Alemán and Diez Barroso, who, according to certain versions, after the death of El Tigre, tried to stay in control of Mexico's most powerful television company. Slim thus became a key factor for Azcárraga's son to remain in the presidency of Televisa. The alliance between Azcárraga Jean and Carlos Slim began to fade out after Ernesto Zedillo concluded his term, and for the first time, a candidate from the opposing political party took office, Vicente Fox Quesada. At that time, Televisa requested the regulatory authorities to force Slim to cease to own 49% of the shares in Cablevisión, as such a situation prevented the expansion of the company established to provide paid television. Thus, in 2002, Slim finally left Cablevisión. Nevertheless, journalist Genaro Villamil, current president of the public broadcasting system of the Mexican state, assures that the bad content of Televisa was the one that provoked the end of the alliance between Televisa and Carso. According to an investigation of his own, Slim complained to Azcárraga Jean for the poor quality of Televisa's content. Another version of Televisa's separation from Slim is that he disagreed with the content. In an interview found on Slim's book by Diego Enrique Osorno, The journalist asked Bernardo Gomez, executive co-chairman of Televisa, about this, and he replied, Joaquin Lopez Doriga has a long personal friendship with Carlos Slim. When did he say anything to him? Never. He didn't even care. Zero. Do you think he gets into the editorial content of the New York Times? Of course not. What he wants is people not to talk about him, please. And the journalist also asked to the Angoitia, CEO of Televisa, is the separation of Televisa and Slim strictly due to the issue of digital convergence? And the Angoitia replies, Televisa has to do what it needs to do to survive. Then he begins to get into telecoms, and the engineer is getting more and more annoyed until he starts to get fed up and says, why am I going to give them money? I'm investing too much into it, so they can buy wires and compete against me. Silly me for doing so. Then he says, no, the truth is, you are treating me very badly. And Telmex will cease advertising. Later on in the same year, Televisa and TV Azteca managed to get the Mexican Congress to pass a series of reforms to the Radio and Television Act, as well as to the Telecom Act, by which both television stations ensured the use, free of charge, of the digital spectrum of frequencies considered as a public good. The fast-track adaptation by lawmakers from all political parties was known as the Ley Televisa Act, in the heat of the post-electoral conflict that the country experienced in 2006, during which Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the left-wing candidate, losing by half a percentage point according to official results, denounced a state fraud in the elections held in July of that year. The government of Vicente Fox Quesada promoted a convergence agreement in favor of the merger of the markets of fixed telephony, television, and the internet. With this maneuver, which benefited Slim's businesses, the PAN administration tried to balance after the creation of Ley Televisa. In 2006, the chances that the left will win for the first time were more real than ever. Before we continue with this topic, let's briefly explore another key point that's closely connected. El Pacto de Chapultepec was the name that Carlos Slim gave to an initiative called based on the old castle that bears the same name. Some members close to Carlos Slim, assured that the El Pacto de Chapultepec was a way to support López Obrador candidacy. This kind of public commitment seeks to guarantee stability and prevent authoritarian temptations like those of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela to appear in the winner of the round for the presidency, who at that time all polls indicated it was López Obrador. El Ingeniero was giving some coverage to Mexican businessmen about López Obrador. However, he belittled such pact, said one of the operators who carried out activities in several states of the country. The then left-wing presidential candidate, who had just been the head of the Mexico City's government, declined to sign the Pacto de Chapultepec, which was initially believed by some to be a platform for Slim's presidential campaign. According to politicians close to López Obrador, Slim offered to the politician of Tabasco financial aid, but he rejected his donations, offered through indirect schemes. Eventually, faced with the adverse outcome, López Obrador denounced an electoral fraud, candidate of the Partido Revolucionario Democrático. While in Calderón's team, Slim was viewed with suspicion due to the closeness he had with Andrés Manuel López Obrador. According to one of Calderón's closest collaborators, the alarm sounded when they learned that while the Tribunal Federal Electoral was examining López Obrador's contestation of the presidential elections, Slim had organized a couple of private meetings with other businessmen and religious and political leaders, in which he commented on the existing situation and the possibility that the country's governability will be lost. Slim's Pacto de Chapultepec maneuvers in 2006 affected his relationship with the Calderón government, although he never broke contact. The president didn't trust him either. In his view, Slim had attempted to give him a technically sound legal action, although in plain terms, some Calderonistas also described what had happened as an attempted coup to prevent Calderón from assuming the presidency. In order to understand the relationship between the current president of Mexico and Carlos Slim, we must focus on the initial symbol of their relationship, which was the downtown of Mexico City, in which Carlos Slim set his sights starting from the year 2000 with the purpose of investing and reviving it economically. Andrés Manuel López Obrador was elected head of the government that year, and together with then President Vicente Fox Quesada, appointed a commission of noteworthy, in which, in addition to participating Slim, did the late official journalist Jacobo Zabludovsky and the writer Carlos Monsiváis. What is known as the rescue of the downtown of Mexico City could also be called the massive property purchase by Slim, with a commitment by a left-wing government to invest more public resources in the area's infrastructure, as well as to evacuate the groups of homeless, indigenous people and sex workers who spent decades settled on their streets. The maneuver itself will give greater value to the area, to such an extent that 10 years later, the properties achieved by Slim at low prices increased in value considerably. Among the hundreds of houses and buildings that he acquired is the Virreyes, a hotel that in the 1960s was a must-see for the best boxers in the country and a couple of other famous people, some sort of that. In his commitment to the future, Slim took advantage of the abandonment and deterioration of another area in Mexico City, close to Polanco, a residential and commercial neighborhood. Nearby, in a degraded area where there used to be a large flour mill and a tire shop, he built a vast complex that includes luxury apartments, the Carso Shopping Center, bearing the initials of Car for Carlos and So for Sumaya, his wife's name, as well as an aquarium, completing what is colloquially known as Slim City. But before we continue, we need to return to the battle between Slim and Azcárraga. A year later, during Calderón's administration, la Comisión Federal de Telecomunicaciones invalidated the Convergence Agreement, announcing the creation of a Plan Técnico Fundamental de Interconexión e Interoperabilidad, which in turn prevented Telmex from participating. That same year, la Suprema Corte de Justicia declared key articles of the Ley Televisa partially unconstitutional, as they fostered monopolistic practices and harm to the public interest, free competition, and the state's leadership. Thus, both Slim and Televisa and TV Azteca found themselves in more or less similar conditions for dispute, facing the new technological reality framed by the triple play service. One will think that this will be the end of the dispute between the telecom giant and the titanic Latin American broadcaster, but it was just the beginning. In 2007, Slim appeared for the first time at the top of the list published by Forbes magazine, documenting the fortunes of the world's richest man. Slim surpassed Gates and Buffett that year, becoming the first Latin American businessman to enter the ranks of the ultra-rich. International attention on the Mexican magnate soared, and he began to make financially notable moves, such as acquiring a stake in the New York Times. Since it was reported that years ago, Slim was vying with Bill Gates for the title of the world's richest man, many analysts began to compare how both men built their fortunes. The owner of Microsoft built his fortune as an innovator who added value to the lives of his customers. Slim became rich by taking advantage of a favorable environment where he enjoyed privileges for monopolies, allowing him to accumulate wealth and political influence. In the face of Calderón's government inaction in resolving the issue of who enters which industry, Slim maintained with Televisa what some experts and officials describe as a low-intensity war. The conflict began to intensify in 2011 as the new presidential elections approached. An article published by El Reforma newspaper about the delay of Vestel, a subsidiary of Televisa, in the installation and operation of a telephone network of ISTE, triggered one of the first open confrontations. After the publication, Televisa placed advertisements in various national newspapers accusing Telmex of causing the delay and stating that Reforma was distorting the reality to serve the economic interest of Slim. In 2011, Grupo Carso announced that it will stop advertising on Televisa and TV Azteca, assuring that the television stations had vetoed it. But by December 1st, 2012, the day of his protest as president, Enrique Peña Nieto seemed to send a message of mediation to the protagonists of the Triple Play War. During the official ceremony held at Palacio Nacional, Slim, Emilio Azcárraga, and Salinas Pliego were accommodated in places together. In most of the photos that circulated, Azcárraga and Salinas Pliego appeared smiling, while next to them Slim not at all. Beyond the apparent message of mediation, people close to Slim assert that the telecom magnate believes that he had the odds against him during the government of Peña Nieto due to the special alliance with Televisa, whose broad support proved essential for the politician to return his political party, El PRI, the presidency of the country. As such, this has been one of the most historic public conflicts between Mexican magnates, two titans fighting over the juicy market of telecoms and the triple play, doing alliance with the political class, loving and including outright attacks of image. But nothing has stopped Slim from diversifying inside and outside the country, nor was it the last thing he will have to face. After its crushing failure in Latin America more than 20 years ago, AT&T, thanks to the purchase of Iusacell, the American company decided to return to Mexico. This was done in the context of the anti-monopoly legislation, which restricts the dominant economic agent, which led América Móvil to reduce its stake to 50% and sell the rest of the assets, according to elpais.com. In less than a year, AT&T went from being a strong ally of América Móvil to becoming its main competitor. For 2015, former President Donald Trump gave his racist speech to start his presidential career, stating that Mexicans immigrating to the United States are rapists and drug traffickers.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards.
So, Hora TV, founded by Carlos Slim and American journalist Larry King, canceled a program in which several companies of Donald Trump were involved at Trump's victory in the US elections caused a significant fall in the value of the Mexican peso, resulting in a considerable loss in Slim's fortune. The magnate, who ranked 5th on the list of the world's richest people of that time, had started the week with remarkable earnings. The anticipation of a victory by Hillary Clinton strengthened the Mexican peso, which came to be quoted at 18.59 pesos per dollar. The businessman himself considered it highly unlikely that the Republican candidate will reach the White House. However, the first election results surprised the markets and caused a sharp depreciation of the Mexican currency. According to Bloomberg's analysis, Slim was the millionaire most affected by the post-Trump victory following the victory of the Republican candidate. El Ingeniero offered his help for the negotiations with Donald Trump, arguing that Mexico should not surrender in its talks, should not yield to the construction of the border wall, nor to the agreements of the formerly known North American Free Trade Agreement. stating that the government should focus on the development of the domestic economy. National program is infrastructure, housing, urban development, urging all Mexicans, political parties, and entrepreneurs to the national union, leading a formal and educated conversation without getting angry, mainly because the United States remains the country's #1 trading partner. In the same year, the influential businessman announced his plans to launch a television channel in the United States aimed at a Mexican audience with the intention of competing with the Hispanic-speaking channels Univision and Telemundo. This new channel, named Nuestra Visión, will be operated by Publicidad y Contenido Editorial, a subsidiary of América Móvil. Nuestra Visión broadcasts content in Spanish, including news and sports, produced in Mexico by the websites Claro Sports and by Uno TV, both owned by the same magnate. While in Spain, the ultra-rich such as George Soros, Bill Gates, and Amancio Ortega managed to acquire Spanish real estate. Carlos Slim was in the process of establishing his own empire in Spain at a very low cost. In December 2015, the Mexican magnate surpassed Soros to become the main shareholder of the construction company FCC, a Spanish corporate group based in Barcelona. After an issue of €1 billion in stocks were carried out to rescue the company, it granted him a stake of 25.6%. Now let's move forward to 2017-2018. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as a presidential candidate at the time, made critical statements about the Texcoco airport. He also expressed concern that money had been allegedly used from Afores, stating that if he won the elections, the project will be moved to Santa Lucia. After winning the elections, López Obrador proposed a popular consultation that lasted for 3 days with the purpose of determining whether the project in Texcoco should continue or whether the airport in Santa Lucia should be built. This vote took place at the end of October of the same year, and finally the new airport was cancelled, in which Slim had funds invested through the Afore and contracts with Carso Infrastructure worth 90 billion pesos, according to Forbes. However, we see something somewhat contradictory in this. Sources such as Expansión mention that the Mexican businessman sent a personal letter to the Mexican president in which he requested authorization to take over the operation of Texcoco's project. A Bloomberg report states that the magnate proposed that the project be transferred to the private corporations and offered his willingness to provide funding. On the other hand, an article in the newspaper El Universal entitled New Airport, Slim Said No, reveals that businessmen and builders, led by engineer Carlos Slim, rejected the idea of moving forward with the project, completing it and managing it under the concession system. The argument was that the new airport in the former Lake Texcoco was of expensive maintenance, so they were not interested in the approach made by Andrés Manuel and his technical team, who made the opinions on the feasibility of the airport work started in the period of Enrique Peña Nieto. So beyond the campaign promises, López Obrador's decision to call a consulta popular was due to the refusal of Slim and another businessman who had the financial resources to assume the responsibility of the new Mexican airport. And with this consultation, the general population will be asked to express their opinion on whether to continue with the current project in Texcoco or whether to choose to maintain the current terminal and build 2 additional runways at the Base Aérea de Santa Lucia itself that determine the destination of the new airport and the construction of the AIFA, temporarily damaging the relationship between the two. A few months later, El Ingeniero reappeared en La Mañanera to announce that an agreement had been reached for the construction of some gas pipelines between Sonora and Chihuahua that had long been stopped due to abusive contracts, as it stipulated a rising income that will start with smaller figures, which will go up and now only be fixed, saying that this will be beneficial to the conglomerate as it will allow more funding and continue with more projects. López Obrador took advantage and said,
se terminara un acuerdo que yo considero muy importante, benéfico para la nación, porque va a significar un ahorro para la hacienda pública de alrededor de 4.500 millones de dólares. Fue muy importante el que haya aceptado participar en este acuerdo desde el inicio. El Grupo Carso, hacer el reconocimiento aquí a Carlos Slim, que fue el primero en llegar al acuerdo con la Comisión Federal de Electricidad. Esto marcó la pauta para lograr los acuerdos posteriores.
Eventually, it was his turn to talk about some of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of the period. The Acuerdo Nacional de Infraestructura, with 147 projects that bring together 159 billion pesos, or about $47 billion by corporate together with the current government in order to trigger economic growth, infrastructure development, and job creation. To which he mentioned, in the past, infrastructure was part of the economic growth, but now there's an interesting phenomenon. Growth will be zero this year, but with investment in infrastructure, it can be the trigger for economic growth. That is clear to the government. It is where you can invest large amounts in the long term, but stress the need for the government to invest at least 5% of the GDP annually in infrastructure. Within the same investment plan, various companies of El Ingeniero were already considered for various sectors, such as telecoms, naturally, with Telmex and Telcel, with an amount estimated of 200 billion Mexican pesos, and as well as its construction conglomerate, Grupo Ideal, with 10 billion pesos. After having started the construction of another major work of Andrés Manuel's government in 2018, the famous Tren Maya, and having stopped for various problems such as from construction in protected areas, environmental debris, and damage to archaeological heritage. 2 years later, Carlos Slim will win a bid through its two construction companies, the Mexican Carso and the Spanish FSC, to build two sections of a total of 235 kilometers railways. There's been also controversy when it comes to Slim's companies dealing with public infrastructure projects, since the wealthiest Mexican has also been pointed out in connection with the collapse of Mexico City Metro Line number 12 on May 3rd, 2021, an incident in which 27 people died and another 80 others were injured. This tragic accident is considered the deadliest in the history of the Mexico City metro system. Several expert reports confirm that the cause of the accident was poor and negligent construction, which was in charge of the company Carso Infraestructura y Construcción. Several media outlets have accused the city government and the president of Mexico of protecting Slim in the midst of the consequences, even to the point of obstructing the investigations carried out by the Norwegian consultant DMV, which was initially commissioned and then withdrawn by the city's government to carry out an independent investigation. In an official agreement with the president, the businessmen agreed to assume the cost of repairing the work and compensate the victims' families in exchange for their silence in the courts. This is not the last controversy with someone who controls the economy arteries of a country as rich as Mexico, nor is it the end of its various business projects, nor near to be able to report them all. The video aims to show the power and the intrigue that causes to have an excessively rich man in the middle of a nation with so much poverty, as we all are part of his immense fortune thanks to him having practically a little of everything or all of a little, mainly due to an odd combination of great networking between the political class and the business elite. without forgetting his great ability in businesses and savvy decisions throughout his career. And finally, just to observe the economic adventures and challenges that involve having so much wealth and power.